So welcome back to Genesis 15. Now you can tell that this is a very loaded and heavy chapter. It has very, very deeply invested emotions and the parties are very, very invested. God is very invested in Abraham's life. Abraham wants to follow God, but he's starting to feel like God is not thinking about him or his needs. And yet, God is not taking his time out of just wanting to take his time, but there are lessons that he wants Abraham to learn. To trust him at all times and to keep the vision front and center regardless of what happens. Okay? And not to look at things in the reality of the physical, but to trust and have faith in God, which is, I think, the most important lesson, is to work with the unseen, to work with a promise, and to take it to the bank, even if it's something you haven't seen. It's a promise, he will keep his promise. And that's what God did. He said, come out, look at the stars, right? Let me see what the other versions say. In the NLT, it says, then the Lord said to him, no, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own. But before we even got to that, but Abram replied, O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you've given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant of my household, will inherit all my wealth. You have given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir. Then the Lord said to him, no, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir. Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. Interesting discussion, right? So God is like, okay, go out and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. And Abraham believed the Lord. Now this is the important thing, to believe God and keep him accountable based on his word, what he said. And Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. Because of his faith. Do you have faith in the things that God has told you? Or did you just brush them off? Did you write them down somewhere and forgot about them? Or do you actually live actively, taking each action, each step of the way, in light of what God said? Now that is faith. But it has to start with you believing God and taking him at his word. Then the Lord told him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans. So he has to remind him and take Abram down memory lane. Sometimes we need to remember what God said and what his mercies have looked like so far in the journey of this life and even the life of your business. How did God keep his promise in the past? How does that bolster what he has said he will do in the future? Because if he has fulfilled his promises in the past, well, then there's a good chance that even in the future, he will not drop the ball. And so the journey that Abram and God have walked needed to be reviewed and recounted. And that's why sometimes you read in the Bible that a certain king, asked for the annals or the books of record to be read to them, because sometimes we forget that others have been through the trouble, or others have walked through the same path, or that even God had this discussion with you before. You forgot that there is a meeting that happened between you and God, and you need to revisit. So, like I said earlier, there's a place for revisiting. Review, and revisit. Revisit records. Just read them. Sometimes it's not even about refreshing your memory. I mean, it's not just about getting a way forward. It's just refreshing your memory on the things that have happened and transpired in the past, and how awesome or glorious they were, how incredible they were. And then you realize, my goodness, if we did that, if we hacked that product, if we hacked that market, if we actually sailed through that business deal, we could always do it again. And even this other thing that is on the table is possible. It can be done, right? So Abraham replied, "O sovereign Lord." So I'm repeating myself. So Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. Then the Lord told him, "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as your possession." In other words, I didn't just bring you out of Ur of the Chaldeans, where your family was located and had lived for centuries maybe, but I brought you out with a reason and a purpose. I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as your possession. That's why I brought you out. He's saying there was a purpose, there was a reason, and this is it. Okay. But Abraham replied, "O sovereign Lord, how can I be sure that I will actually possess it?" Right? Promises, going back to the virtue and the value of valuing the promises. So what he's worried about now is how will he know, which is the indicator that I said earlier, God does not owe you all the information before you learn to trust him. He just requires that you trust him on what he told you, regardless of whether it's complete or incomplete. But human beings, we need to see the full picture, right? So Abraham replied, "O sovereign Lord, how can I be sure that I will actually possess it?" In other words, he's wondering, maybe his friends had told him, I don't know about this God of yours, but it doesn't look like he's going to keep his promise. Or are you sure he's going to keep his promise? Or are you even sure you know what you're doing? Do you really know what you're doing? And sometimes we're provoked by people who are not in our discussion with God. They were not part of the plan. And that's what we talked about even when Noah was building the ark. The instruction was given to Noah. So the people that were not in the meeting that Noah had with God, they're wondering, why are you building an ark? Well, and that's the same thing that happened with with Adam. Adam was given instruction regarding the tree of life and the tree of good and evil. And his work was to protect himself from going against the will of God by eating from those trees. But the serpent wasn't part of the meeting, so he was asking Eve, did God really say? Did God really say? Did he really tell you that? In other words, he's trying to act as if God lied or God deceived them or God really didn't mean what he said. And it's almost the same variation of Abraham's questioning here. He's like asking God, did you really mean what you said? Did you really intend to carry out the promise that you gave me? Did you really mean it? And how can I tell? Give me a sign. Show me that it was true, that I wasn't imagining my own things. Show me that we are on course on this plan. Show me that we are still with this, that you're still down for this, that you're still on it, that it's still work in progress, or we're on the right track, are we on the right path? Are we tracking, Or am I alone in this now? So when Abraham believed God, that was one thing. But the other question he asked, or the other thing he needed, was an indicator from God that it's coming soon. Sometimes you need a gauge, like a timing gauge. Like it's 2 years from now, or it's 1 year, or 6 months. And sometimes God doesn't give us that. Like, even when you have planned it on paper, it doesn't work like that. Like, the timings are not how you had planned or envisioned them, because everything is in God's hands at the end of the day. So, what did Abraham do? After God reminds him, "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as your possession," meaning that is why I brought you out of the Ur. That was the purpose, and we are on course. But Abraham replied, "O sovereign Lord, how can I be sure that I will actually possess the land?" So he asks, how will I know? How will I know? How do I know? How can I be sure? And the Lord told him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat. Now, this is not what you expect. I mean, honestly, if you ask God a question like that, you don't expect more instructions. But now he's given more instructions. And the thing about God is, sometimes an answer is in your obedience to the next instruction. And the next instruction that you obey leads to maybe another instruction. It's like you're opening doors. It's like you open the main door and then a door in the corridor that leads to another door that leads to the living room that leads to, by the time you get to the intimate parts of the house, like the more secret places, the language is so coded and you need to reveal or unveil one code at a time. So that's what God is doing. He's showing him the way to the answer, but it requires a few other steps. And the Lord told him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old female goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove and a young pigeon. So even with us, in the form of business, the answers are not outright. Sometimes it is in your tinkering with other things and you're exploring other options, hopefully that are in line with God, that you get answers. Or when you hear the response of God to do something else, instead of getting discouraged, you just do what God tells you to do. Because in that extra move or extra step that you take, that's probably where the answer really lies. So you have to still cooperate with God through to the end, regardless of the turns and the twists. And Abraham replied, how can I be sure that I will possess it? And God tells him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old female goat and a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove and a young pigeon. So Abraham presented all these to him and killed them. Okay? So he followed that instruction. Then he cut each animal down the middle and laid the halves side by side. He did not, however, cut the birds in half. Some vultures swooped down to eat the carcass. So Abraham was already familiar with the covenant and the actions of covenant. And this was clear that God wanted to make a covenant with him. And this was the sign. The sign would be the covenant. Okay, so this is like when you're going to to sign a deal. That is the indicator. The contract being signed is an indicator that this thing is solid. And that is what God was doing with Abraham. He was going to sign a covenant. Was going to seal a deal with him, with Abraham. And so this sealing of the deal was in a ritual, or it was in this sacrifice that was about to be made, and that is how they did, or they cut their covenants at that time, in those days. So it was as good as the contract is about to be signed. So that's what happened. So the vultures swooped down to eat the carcasses, but Abraham chased them away. So Abraham did not allow anything to get in the way of this contract being signed. So the vultures here represent people who are opportunists, and people who want to rob the opportunity, or things that want to cut off or sabotage what God is about to do. So he did not allow those to come in the way of his blessing, or his indicator of the blessing coming along. So, as the sun was going down, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a terrifying darkness came down over him. Then the Lord said to Abram, you can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land, where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. This is not what you want to hear, but this is God giving him intelligence or information that will strengthen his capacity to believe that this is part of God's plan. So he says, you can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land. In other words, this is the grand scheme of things, okay? And this is what's about to happen down the line. So that you believe me that even this promise that I've given you of a son is a means and it's just a part of the puzzle. It's just one piece to the puzzle. But 400 years from now, this is what will happen. Your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. But I will punish the nation that enslaves them, and in the end, they will come away with great wealth. As for you, you will die in peace and be buried at a ripe old age. After 4 generations, your descendants will return here to this land, for the sins of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction. So, God was waiting for the Amorites' sins to be maximized. And in that period, the children of Abraham would be, or the descendants would be in slavery. But once the Amorites, you see, so there's a plan. Once the Amorites were ready, having fully sinned and fulfilled the reason for the penalty that God is about to issue, then these slaves would now be sent home back to the land that they would have possessed all along, which is this land that God has promised Abraham. So they will return here to this land, for the sins of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction. So there's a reason why everything is taking place at the pace that is taking place. There are other parties called the Amorites who also need to fulfill their end of the bargain, whether they know it or not. But there's a lot, there are many fires, there are many pots cooking at the same time. And then God actually tells Abraham that this is the sign. Because God said, Abraham wanted a sign. He wanted to know for sure that God would fulfill his end of the bargain. Okay, how can I be sure that I will actually possess it? So it wasn't Abraham, it wasn't him that would possess it. So God shows him the trend that he can expect, the projection, the plan, the blueprint. And God tells him, after 4 generations, your descendants will return here to this land, for the sin of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction. So there is a general plan that God is following, which Abraham was not previously or prior to, privy to, and so he thought that God had forgotten about him, but God was working out his plan. So even for us, God is working out his plan. It is in stages, it is phased, it has outcomes, it has different parties, and everybody has got to be in position for his plan to be fulfilled. Everything has to be in place. So while you're thinking that God is taking his time, he's actually planned it all out to details. It is just that things have to run their course, and at the given time, they will be manifested, or there will be evidence to what the plan was all along. Right now, you have to work with faith. You have to work with faith. So it's interesting that when Abraham asked for the sign to know how it would pan out, God tells him to bring a sacrifice. And sometimes we have to lay something in the ground or sow a seed for more to be revealed. It's like we're turning on a light or opening a door. Sometimes it requires a sacrificial giving to open a door, like I said, which opens another door, It is through our giving that we open doors. Giving to God opens doors. Sacrificing to God opens doors. Giving to God opens doors. So remember, we've been talking about tithing as a business and giving as a business. Well, guess what? It's not just a good principle. It actually, giving, even free will offerings, opens doors. Creating an altar for God to come and visit you opens doors. Living a righteous life opens doors. That, it opens doors and portals to things that not everybody knows. Not everybody knows. I don't think even the Amorites understood that there was a timing for their mass slaughter. Yeah, there would be a time where they would be massacred, and they didn't know that. But Abraham has privilege, or is privy to this information, because he has sought to understand the mind of God. And that's all we need to do sometimes, is just to to express our desire to know something. It doesn't mean you will always be shut out from knowing the word, knowing the mind of God. But it was courageous of Abraham to ask some of these things. And yeah, sometimes we just need to ask God, hello, what's going on? What's going on? How can I tell for sure that you're still with me and that you're going to fulfill your promise towards me? And then he gives, which is another thing. The giving opens doors. So always remember, God has a plan. God always has a plan. So after the sun went down and darkness fell, Abram saw a smoking fire pot. So this is God sealing the deal. He's sealing the deal. He's putting ink on paper. So Abram saw a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch pass between the halves of the carcasses. Of course, the carcasses belonged to Abraham, but essentially it is God who provided the wealth to Abram. So he was just making the things that God had requested available. And God will probably even tell you what you need to sacrifice or what you need to offer unto him for your breakthrough or your understanding to be opened. Because now after this covenant, there was no turning back for Abraham. He knew that he knew with the depths of his soul that God was serious and he was going to fulfill his promise. Had he not asked for answers, he probably wouldn't have gone the extra mile of getting the 3 rams and the 3 and the 3 and the 3, different animals that were requested, so that he would obey God in providing them, and then God would in turn show him all these things that would follow. So it is a good practice to seek answers from God, but also in obedience, find the things that he wants you to do and find out what he'd want you to do in order to open that portal of information from your inquiry. So after the sun went down, Abraham saw a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch pass between the halves of the carcass. So darkness had fallen. So he was able to see this smoking fire pot very clearly and the flaming torch passing between the halves of the carcasses. So the Lord made a covenant with Abram that day and said, I have given this land to your descendants, meaning it is done. I have given this land to your descendants all the way from the border of Egypt. He even knows the border. All the way from the border of Egypt to the great Euphrates River. Remember we talked about Euphrates in, I believe, Genesis 2. And the land now occupied by the Kenites, Kenizzites, Kadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. So it's very, 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 very vivid and practical. It's very clear, very detailed in his response after the 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old female goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove were offered, and a young pigeon, turtle dove and a pigeon. So there are prerequisites to deeper knowledge of the mind of Christ or the mind of God, and you need to be willing to pay the price for assurance. It's not that assurance is always going to be guaranteed, but at least if God chooses to respond with an instruction, then you follow the instruction. At least then you will be able to know for sure what his mind is. So be willing to follow through with God's instruction regarding your business for whatever angle he wants you to take in approaching the question or the challenge at hand. God is a problem solver. He has all the solutions that you need. So it's just a question of consulting him. And when he gives further instruction, then you do it. Whatever much or however much it takes. And then guard your end of the bargain, because there will be vultures. There will be people who will want to sabotage the appearance of God or want to sabotage your answer from coming or arriving. But God will show up if you protect your end of the bargain. So you need to do that. You need to protect your end of the bargain, or what He asks of you. Faith is one major item. You need to have faith. But not only that, you also need to follow through with the instructions that He gives you. So that was Genesis chapter 15, which I have covered in 2 parts or 2 audios. If you haven't listened to the previous audio, it's longer than this one. And this one is like half the duration of the previous one. Just make sure that you do. Remember that this is Verdant. Verdant Business Coaching is your business coach for a startup or organization. We offer foundational technical assistance and coaching, and that is why we're doing this series on Genesis, just to pick out some nuggets that God wants to give us regarding running your business. Bye bye for now. God bless you. See you next time.